Welcome to the Data Room, where we share best practices and actionable tips on being a data-driven company, or as we call it, data first. If you're a B2B revenue leader looking to scale your growth stage business, come and join experienced CEO and tech founder Scott Stouffer in the Data Room. Welcome to the Data Room. It's another episode here with Heather Kitos and Scott Stouffer, co-founder and CEO of scaleMatters. Today, let's talk about scaling. So obviously, that's a popular topic for many seed and growth stage companies. Many of our listeners listening to this podcast right now, you've probably experienced either firsthand or have heard about the inevitable growth problems that a company will have as they scale. So for example, you'll probably need to fill in specific people gaps, but you might also have to think about redoing your operational processes, reevaluating your tech stack. But what many companies don't spend time thinking about when scaling is their data model. So I'd love to spend a few minutes today, Scott, about talking about any situations or examples when a company has a data infrastructure that's not scalable. And what does that look like?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so during the very early stages of a company, it's usually the founder or some of the founders that are typically involved in every discussion with prospective customers. And though they may not formally perform any kind of statistical analysis of data based on those conversations, their intuition is pretty well informed because they've participated in all of the calls with prospective customers. The absolute numbers are very small, so they can quickly glance at the CRM, assuming they're even using one, and kind of immediately tell if the status of any given opportunity seems appropriate and it seems up to date, or if something doesn't look right. As the company grows, however, they start to add salespeople, and those salespeople engage in a lot more prospect conversations. So at that point, it's not really practical for the founders or the senior leaders to really be involved on every call. So they get more and more removed from the prospects, and the reliability of their intuition then starts to diminish because you're not getting it backed up or reinforced with participation in these phone calls. So to compensate for that, the leaders need to start to rely on data, which is what they use to inform their decision making. In our experience, I'd say the first pressure point when companies begin to scale is that the senior leaders begin to lose that intimate understanding of their prospects compared to when they were participating directly in the sales calls. So that, as they lose that intimate understanding, it makes it tougher to figure out how to position or, what the product roadmap should look like, et cetera, things like that. So this is really the first place we see companies' data infrastructure breaking down, mostly because they actually don't have any data infrastructure for this. So they don't really have an automated approach to surfacing data from these conversations that informs about the prospects or about the competition for that matter. So they start leaning on the sales team to effectively take much better notes, enter those notes into the CRM, et cetera. But of course, it's really hard to be completely present and engaged in a sales call if you're also furiously trying to write everything down that was said. So it just doesn't happen. So the information we get from the sales calls is spotty at best, and as a result, it becomes more and more difficult to really optimize your targeting around your ICP, optimize your messaging, or even your competitive positioning. So that's kind of the first place that we see get stressed as companies begin to scale, as they just become a little bit more removed from the customers or the prospects, and so they aren't able to really kind of dial in some of that product market message fit stuff. I'd say the second place the data infrastructure fails when scaling is the integrity of the CRM data itself. So much of the CRM data is manifested in the way salespeople interact with the CRM. And when companies are initially growing the sales staff at a fairly good rate, they often haven't taken the time to formalize training of these folks during the onboarding process or to configure the CRM in a way that enforces consistent behavior. And as a result, you see kind of the salespeople all use the CRM in a slightly different way, And this ends up impacting the data hygiene. It's very weak. The data tends to be very inconsistent because of this fact. And then I'd say the third thing that stands out from our experiences as companies begin to scale and what starts to break down is the ability to efficiently analyze data to expose, let's say, high-impact, actionable insights for the senior leadership team. So this really happens for two reasons. One, companies begin to overly customize their CRM to the point that kind of no single person understands all of the data points that are in it, and then it makes it very difficult to even know what one is supposed to be analyzing. But secondly, because of the need to have very granular data to help drive optimization, the sheer volume of the data becomes unmanageable using the traditional analysis tools such as, let's say, Salesforce reports or Excel. But beyond the issues of analytical efficiency, most companies, at least until they get to maybe, say, $50 million in annual revenue, they don't actually have anybody on the go-to-market team who's really dedicated to taking the time to fully analyze the data, or that even has necessarily the competence to do so. And as a result, you end up with a bunch of data stuck in the tech stack, which may or may not be potentially valuable, but in any case, it never really sees the light of day to become actionable. So long-winded answer, but I'd say first place breaks down is understanding of the customers. Second place is the hygiene of the CRM data. And the third thing that becomes stressed is just the ability to analyze the data.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. You made a really good point about as your company grows, if you're a leader, you're more removed from the kind of day-to-day, in the weeds kind of conversations that help inform all of the decisions you're making. You make a great point about as those conversations continue to happen and continue to happen without you, if you're kind of a revenue leader, you don't get the insights that you want because they're happening so frequently, and that's a good thing, right? Because you're growing. But at the same time, having some sort of data infrastructure to measure that and not be so overly customized is just a great point, because I think a lot of companies get into the CRM, see that they can do so many different things and customize so many different ways that you don't think about the scalability of that when you're growing. So if you are kind of in that space of wanting to grow and scale and create a data infrastructure that is scalable, how do you catch these issues early? I think you mentioned first off, creating a data infrastructure or thinking about it is a great first step. Are there any other things that companies should be aware of so that they don't run into these data integrity issues or data scaling issues so it snowballs into a bigger problem?
Yeah, I would say, so if you think about the first point of becoming more and more removed from an understanding of the prospects, I think there is a way to deal with that. And best practices to deal with that would include implementing one of these conversation analysis or conversation intelligence tools like Gong or Chorus, and then configuring those tools with these very granular trackers so that all of the information you would want to glean from the calls or all of the stuff you would want to understand about what the prospects are saying is automatically generated, which allows you to actually, as you scale, keep your finger on the pulse of what the market's saying. So that's step one, as I'd say, very important to kind of automate the ability to capture that information from sales conversations. In terms of the data integrity breakdowns that come with growing sales teams, I would say, first of all, it's important to invest in RevOps talent at the earliest possible moment so you can ensure that the tech stack is configured with data integrity in mind. Too many companies go way too long with someone on the sales or marketing team essentially acting as the tech stack administrator. And unfortunately, they're not typically experts at this stuff, and they don't really have the experience to do this right the first time. And as a result, the data often gets sort of messed up before somebody comes in that actually has a good understanding of how to make those tools work in a way that sort of aids in the integrity of the data. And I'd say, I think thematically, growing companies tend to ramp the size of their sales team prior to establishing the appropriate infrastructure to make scaling easier. So I'd say our view is best practices says get your data infrastructure right early because that will help make all of your salespeople more effective, and it's going to drive the highest return on your sales and marketing investment. And I think too many companies wait until it's obvious that they have to, invest in their data infrastructure, and by that point, it's obvious because they're incurring substantial pain, right? And so the smarter companies are understanding this and making those investments up front, which just drives a whole lot more efficiency downstream.
It makes sense, right? If you're building a house, you want to set a good foundation before you start building everything else up. I totally agree with you that a lot of companies think the best answer or the best strategy to scale is just hire a bunch more salespeople, which if you don't have the right processes and the right tech stack and the right model in place, you're probably gonna end up incurring a lot of more pain earlier than you thought as you scale too. So that's a good point. I definitely appreciate this perspective. And if you are looking for some guidance into building a scalable data model so you don't run into these problems, we're here to help. And I think the first step I'd recommend is going to scalematters.com/assessment. We're offering a complimentary data integrity assessment for listeners of this podcast. So check out scalematters.com/assessment. We have a lot of experience in helping companies avoid these problems. So I think it's a great place to start. On behalf of Scott and on behalf of myself, thanks for joining us on another episode of The Data Room.
Thanks.